This section is going to focus exclusively on Docker Compose, which is a combination of a command line tool and a configuration file. The requirements for this section are that you really need to know a lot of the fundamentals from the last few sections around images and containers. So as we're going through this course, you're probably going to start to hear me get more and more excited because things just keep getting better, right? So as you learn one component, you're thinking, man, bind mounts and volumes are really cool. That's going to save me some time. I can imagine how I'm going to use that, blah, 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 blah. Well, then I'm going to come with the next thing that's going to be even better than what you just learned. And in this case, it couldn't be more true. Docker Compose. So what is it and why do we care? So few software services are truly standalone. When you think about your containers, they're a single process solution, and we're rarely going to use just a single container to solve a problem or provide a service to our customers. Our containers will often require other containers such as SQL or key value and other applications that we'll need to run in containers like proxies or web front ends or back-end workers and so on. So what if we had a way to connect all those pieces of our solution together where we didn't need to remember all of our Docker run options and then get them into discrete virtual networks with relationships between them and only expose the public ports and then spin them all up and tear them down with one command? Well, that's Docker Compose. So before we dive in, we need to clear up that there's two parts of Docker Compose. The first part is the YAML file, and it's super simple to understand. It's written in YAML, and if you've never dealt with YAML, that is a very easy configuration language. It's almost as easy as an INI file would be. I actually think it's easier because it shows hierarchy, and we'll dive into that. And that file is where you would specify all the containers you need to run, the networks you need, any volumes you might need, environment variables, images, and all sorts of other configuration options. And then the second part of Docker Compose is a CLI tool, which is Docker-Compose, that we use normally for just local dev and test, using that YAML file we created to simplify our Docker commands. Let's talk about that Docker Compose file. There's actually versions to the things that you can put in the Compose file. So when Docker Compose was created years ago, it was actually called Fig, and it was just assumed version 1. It didn't actually even list a version in the file. As it's matured and added new features to what the file can have in it, such as networks and volumes, they have created the version statement, which is actually the first line in the file. And this file can actually be used with the Docker Compose CLI, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this is, again, mainly for local development management and just making it easier to get around in your environments on your local machine. But now, starting with the beginning of 2017, we have version 1.13, and anything beyond that, these files can now be used directly with the Docker command line in production with Swarm. And of course, there's great help at the command line with the --help. And as we look at some of the examples, know that the Docker Compose file is the default name, but you can actually use any file name you want as long as it's proper YAML and that you use the -f to specify which file you're trying to use. So if I open up my editor and look at the template here, I just wanted to show some of the outline of what this is supposed to look like. And we have the version value in the beginning. The newest version in the first quarter of 2017 is 3.1, but I always make it at least version 2. If you don't add the line there, it's always assumed to be version 1, but I don't recommend that because you lose a lot of the features. So I typically start with version 2, and then if I need specific features out of version 3 and 3.1, I end up typing the version number in there. And you'll see the other three main sections are services, volumes, and networks, right? So this is hierarchical. So under services, everything can be 2 or 4 spaces, but it does need to be consistent. If you just look up YAML on the internet, you'll find some sites that guide you with the specifics of how to format this file. And if you're using a modern editor, it's going to actually speak the YAML language and know how to deal with these files and their formatting. But usually here, you have at a minimum services, which is really just containers. The reason I actually call them services is because each container that you create in here, you could actually have multiple ones of those containers for redundancy. So they needed to come up with a different word. And I think services is great because that's basically what you're doing, right? Each container or containers that are identical that you're using are usually providing a service to something. So underneath the service name, and again, you can call that whatever you want. It doesn't have to be the name of the image, or it doesn't have to be anything related at all. It could be Barney for the service name, but it will be the DNS name that we'll find out later is used inside of your Docker networks, similar to when you give the -- name to a Docker run command. And here I've shown that we can optionally specify the image. We can specify the alternate command to run. So if we wanted to overwrite the actual command that was specified in the image when we run it, we can do that here. And basically all the things we do from the Docker run command, we can save them here. Because that's what really this is about, is taking all of the work out of remembering all the different things in Docker run command for those things you're running constantly. If you have your own development environments or your own tools, you probably don't want to type those commands over and over, and shell scripts can only do so much, right? So this file would actually replace a shell script that would automate your Docker run commands. This is a much better way to do it. It's easier to read and it's better documented. And you'll notice that spaces in here are allowed. You can have spaces and comments wherever you want. And if you had multiple services, you just need to make sure they're unique names. Then the other parts that we specify are volumes and networks. And again, these are optional as well. And it's basically the same rules as when you're running from the command line. If you were to ever need to use the Docker volume create or the Docker network create commands, and again, you don't always have to, it just depends on your situation, you can put them here as well. So let's look at a real world simple example. You remember in the last section, we had a lecture where we used Jekyll really quick to just do a bind mount example. So this is what the compose file would look like for that Docker run command. And you'll see that I've specified the image here. I've named it Jekyll. I've given it a volume. And you'll notice instead of using the pwd, compose actually understands the dot, meaning this is the current working directory I'm in. Just use this directory that I'm running the compose file from. Then the ports or the -p option. And you'll notice some little things about YAML where when something only has one option, like there's only going to be one image for each service, it would usually be a key and value format like this. If it's going to be a list of items like volumes and ports where you can have multiple ones, you'll notice that the compose file usually has a plural. Instead of volume, it's volumes. And instead of port, it's ports. And then there'll be a list format with a dash. If we jump into another example real quick, you'll see that in this one, this is actually a sample WordPress setup where you have the database service down here that's running a database container, and then the WordPress web server container up top. And you'll notice a little thing that's different about this one is that we're using the environment variables, which would be the same as a -e at the command line. But instead of a list format where we have a dash, this is again another key and value statement. So in this format, we don't use the dash. We just list the key and the value. And if I needed to add another one, I would just do that here. And all of these would be passed into the container when it runs using the compose command line. And then lastly, we have one more example. This one's a little more complicated. It's actually one I was working on recently to set up a 3 database server cluster behind a Ghost web server. Ghost is actually a blog system similar to WordPress. And you'll see that I have multiple environment variables for each one of these containers. So I've got my Ghost container up top, and then I actually have this thing known as a SQL proxy, which sits in front of my SQL servers and acts as a load balancer and failover solution. And then I have each of my 2 MySQL servers. And you'll notice another option down here that says depends on. And depends on is a pretty common one. It basically helps Compose understand the relationship between these services, and it knows that if I need to start my Ghost one, then I also need to start other ones as well. You can see up here that my Ghost one actually depends on these, and we'll get into the details of how all this works in later lectures. But for now, this is probably a lot to digest and all these different commands and whatnot, but trust that Docker has some really great documentation on their website. And if you just look for Docker compose file on Google, you'll probably find this with the first couple of hits. It's going to be under the docs.docker.com website as usual. And it's going to be documentation about every single little key and value option you have. You'll see the depends on I just mentioned. You'll see environment here. where it shows different ways to put in environment variables. And what's great about this documentation is it gives you plenty of examples. Personally, I'm on this site every day, just like I'm on the Docker run command options page or the compose command options page. I'm constantly referencing these because there's just frankly so many features nowadays that I can't remember them all. And so I keep them close in my bookmarks. So now that we have a general idea of what the compose file format might look like, let's jump over to the command line and learn about the Docker Compose CLI tool.